So our next speaker is Rachel Webster, and based at Manchester Museum, and she's going to be discussing poisons in herbaria. So Rachel very kindly agreed to talk for us. So she's been the Curator of Botany at Manchester Museum since 2012 and is responsible for the care and use of the botanical collections, organising student teaching, engagement projects, public events and museum outreach.
Thank you, Laura. I'm sure you gave more details to my bio than I did there. So can everyone see that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Lovely. Is it showing the, yeah, there we go. So I'm similarly going to say, I said that I've had 12 years of experience at Manchester Museum, because that means that at least for the first half of this talk, what I'm going to say is very focused on the sort of experiences that we've had in our collection. So Manchester Museum, then, if you haven't visited us, we're part of the University of Manchester, and the herbarium is a kind of mixed botanical collection of various different sources of material. So we're not just a sort of herbarium sheets, but plenty of kind of 3D material too. So I was thinking about this this talk really, and I thought there's really kind of two key things that you'd end up asking of your botanical collections, and when thinking about poisons, and that is whether the specimens themselves have been deliberately poisoned with preservatives, or whether there was something inherently toxic about the plant that was collected in the first instance. So I thought I'd just run through a few of our kind of experiences with these two situations. So the first one, then, thinking about, are these specimens poisoned? So as I'm sure all of you are well aware, that the most common instance of toxins that you're going to come into contact with in a herbarium collection is going to be the consequence of putting mercuric chloride onto preserve botanical specimens. Very often this is thought to be really utilised in particular periods of botanical collecting more than at other times, but our experience here is that that's not necessarily always the case, and you can't go on just date alone as expecting something to be safe by being more modern. So if you go on to the Health and Safety Executive and the government websites, you can terrify yourself if you're a little bit prone to hypochondria by looking at the various different things that mercury can do to the body and the effects that it can have. There are two key routes, obviously, for how you might come into contact with this mercuric chloride that has been on the herbarium sheets. One is through touching the material and then transferring it from your hands into your face and mouth, or perhaps through cuts or open wounds. And the other, which is a sort of perhaps more dangerous and less easy to sort of personally regulate for, I guess, is the inhalation of evolved mercury that has come off the sheets. So we then, in order to have some sort of sense as to whether this is something that you need to consider, you need to work out whether your specimens are going to be poisoned or not. And obviously the best case scenario then, oh, my computer has stopped moving slides, that's very useful, is that the collector themselves tells you. So this is the absolute peak of our documentation and health and safety in regards to this matter, because the collector themselves, they have annotated the sheets to say which specimens are poisoned. So if you are physically working in the cabinets, you will come across those which are stamped. So you are you're aware of the hazard as you are handling the actual sheets. And then, thanks to the work of my predecessors in the museum, there's been excellent documentation of this acquisition, and so it's also specified within our collections records, so that you know if you're looking up a particular specimen, you know in advance before you go to it. But this is one of our most modern acquisitions. So this material is between, say, about 45 up to perhaps about 20 years old. And so this is one of the key parts of our herbarium that we do know has been treated with preservatives. In this instance, it doesn't actually specify what has been put on it, but because this is a living collector, that's a conversation we can have to confirm what it is that will be on the sheets and whether that's the same in every case of the plants that he's donated to us. Other records we have, and much like everyone else, I would imagine, we've got archived material that can be hard to access, hard to read, shut away in boxes, and takes quite a lot of work by dedicated students and volunteers to work through and to be able to get to it. So this is just an example from one of our 19th century collectors, Leo Grindon, who has dreadful handwriting and is using sort of antiquated terminology. So here we've got corrosive sublimate in spirit of wine. But thanks to someone having gone through it and tried to read all of this and transcribe it, we can now sort of make an educated guess that most of the material that he donated to us isn't actually treated. So a lot of the earlier material was the ones that he had poisoned. So we've got getting this kind of mixed scenario of some is, some isn't. It isn't always marked. Sometimes we're lucky and it is. And then it's also worth mentioning, okay, it's not changing, that sometimes the information might be there, but it might not be in English. So you might have specimens that have come in prepared from elsewhere. So this is a lovely collection of prepared mushrooms from G. Herpel. And this is actually quite well marked to say which ones have been treated with mercury, but you have to be able to recognize where that's saying it on the label and how he's described his practice. So we're very lucky really as part of the university that we obviously have people with additional skills who are happy to come in and volunteer and looking for experience to do that kind of work, who can help us to go through and to see what we can find in the way of actual documentation and work that can help us. So looking then at the sheets, physically looking at the specimens, you can sometimes decide that you have got mercury is a likely contaminant on the sheet with kind of darker spotting and perhaps kind of blackish colours to the leaves as a result of putting it on there. But it can be really difficult to, especially if you've got volunteers and students who aren't enormously experienced in coming into contact with it, that there's an awful lot of other marks that can be on the paper that confuse people into thinking that maybe there's a toxin on there. So I've got some examples here of pictures of sort of foxing of the paper. We've got natural oils that have come out of the specimens and have stained and left marks, residues of the glues that have been used to stick things down. And so we do end up occasionally with information that's in our database that is perhaps slightly less than useful, with a lot of, well, this may be, and this could be, and perhaps this might have been mercury. So one project that we haven't really undertaken in any great detail in Manchester, but it might be nice to do, and it's certainly been done very successfully in other places, is then to take some of those sheets where you suspect that might be mercury staining and to look with UV light to reveal if your suspicions are true. So there's quite a lot of nice examples online, if you go searching for it, of other people's work where they have been testing to see if the staining is got traces of mercury. So I've got this example here. There's a poster online from this link from the Swedish National Heritage Board, where they've combined UV tests along with kind of elemental analysis to correspond with what they've got. And there's a lovely blog from Victoria Purell at Amagerfa Cymru about their work looking at UV analysis of the herbarium sheets. So this is something which can be really useful if you think you've got particularly contaminated sheets, you've got something with markings that are deeply suspicious. You can do this kind of work to confirm that, and then work to sort of mitigate these risks and manage people's exposure to this, particularly to the herbarium papers that are associated with these specimens. I think as a consequence of the type of researchers that we've got at the university here, a lot more of the work that's been done around our herbarium has been to do with the evolved mercuric gases. So we've had various measurements done both by our health and safety services and also by certain academics who have been measuring to see what the levels of mercury reach within the herbarium spaces. And all of the tests that have been conducted so far have happily had us below the guidelines for exposure within the herbarium itself. I think we're helped by being in the attic and having some very large rooms with a lot of air in them. But that within the containment of the specimen boxes, if there are specimens in there that have been treated with mercury, then the levels can rise really significantly and reach kind of problematic levels. So a lot of our work really around this has been trying to manage those risks in terms of the way that people access the collections and ventilating the spaces. So throughout most of the museum, everyone's focusing on no eating and drinking, largely to protect the specimens. But up here, we have the added kind of please no eating and drinking, because we have to consider ourselves more as a laboratory space in which there's not only the risk of harming the specimens, but the risk of them harming you too. In terms of PPE, we do recommend that people use powder-free nitrile gloves, although I find that a lot of herbarium users are more comfortable just working through specimens with their hands only for not fumbling the papers and so on. And so we have hand washing facilities available and encouraging people to use them quite regularly. We also have to think about other kinds of PPE in the event that the specimens are in perhaps not such good condition. So if there is dust or frass, to be thinking about using masks to avoid breathing in any dust that has been contaminated. The main thing that we do for dealing with vapor buildup within the boxes is that we specify in our risk assessments that we have these particular herbarium boxes with the front flap which drops down, and to open those and to walk away for a moment or two so that the heavier mercury vapors will escape the box and go and drop to the floor level away from the person who's working in them. And so what this also means is that we need a well-ventilated space to be working in. So we've got our herbarium consists of a number of rooms, so we'll be keeping those doors open to make sure that there's airflow around the space while people are actively working through the collections. But it is something we need really to go through a new process of testing for mercury vapor in the herbarium, because the university has done some really very useful work for the comfort of the people who work up here in putting in new double glazing and so on. And so we have to consider that our space has changed and it is perhaps a little bit less leaky than it used to be. And that's something that we need to get on and think about. So if you're going through a process of looking at specific herbarium sheets and looking at them with UV light, that also means you can recognise those which are the most problematic. And so you then have the option of removing the specimen, remounting it onto fresh papers. And so by doing this, you will hopefully over time be lessening the hazard within the collection, because you'll be removing some of the contaminated material from out of the collection. So you might retain the specimen and the mercuric chloride that is actually on the leaf, but if there's extensive contamination on the papers, you can be removing that to improve the situation and to reduce some of the content within the collection. I thought it was also worth saying, really, for Manchester, we've got the poisons that we know people are putting onto the collection to preserve them. But Manchester has, throughout its history, had some truly filthy air. And so we have a lot of probably quite toxic material accidentally contaminating our specimens too. So, I mean, this is one of the main reasons I would recommend people using gloves whilst accessing our herbarium, is that they can be absolutely filthy. So particularly where there has been, say, a bulkier specimen, and so there is a pocket of dead air effectively between herbarium sheets, that's given the opportunity for the particulate soot in Manchester's air to fall out and to rest on the sheet and on the specimens. And of course, this will contain any nasties that were coming out of the smokestacks of industrial Manchester before the Clean Air Act. So we have to presume that there's also things in here such as lead and cadmium and other kinds of heavy metal. I would really love to get this tested. I would like to know whether this is the museum's soot or whether it's the soot of the different collectors. So whether there's any difference between, say, one collector's office and another collector's office, or is this genuinely the filth that was inside the museum at the time? But it is something we have to be very aware of, and in cleaning specimens, particularly if they're going out for display or on loan, this is something that we have to deal with before we get to that point. So moving on then to think about, are the specimens poisonous in and of themselves? So obviously there are a lot of toxic plants out there in the world, and there's a fairly limited amount of information as to how well a lot of these compounds will survive in historic collections. But there are some certain kind of key things to think about, and particularly for us in Manchester, that's because we have other non-herbarium sheet material. So we have a fairly sizable collection of fruits and seeds. We have a really large materia medica collection that's come from the university's pharmacy department, as well as some biocultural material. So we have anything that was fully worked and an actual artifact and object has made it into our living cultures collection. But things which are, say, raw materials or things which are in preparation, partly made, might have ended up in the herbarium as a kind of use of a vegetable product, as it were. So we do have some of those materials to consider as well. Then there's, of course, the fungi. They're very clever at making interesting chemicals, and to a certain extent, some of the herbarium sheets too. So as I said, for us, one of the big considerations is our materia medica collection. So that plus the fruits and seeds is several thousand jars and boxes in various states of preservation. And in the main, these are things which have come from our School of Pharmacy, where it was partly a display of material as a nice thing to look at as you entered the school, but also it was a genuine learning tool. So the pharmacists in training would be going and taking out small subsections of material and working out how to prepare those into whatever drugs and medicines they were going to have to prescribe in future, dispense. So this as well as containing an awful lot of what we would now just rate as herbs and spices, there is the potential that these kind of collections contain things which are genuinely medicinal, and largely that also is dose related, and so will probably be poisonous. So for some of these, then it's really clear that this material has the potential to still be dangerous. So, for instance, this one was a known potential hazard within our Materia Medica collection. And I know Jen Discombe is on this call, who was the conservator who helped us kind of stabilise this object. So the label reads, Curarian original calabash from Mrs. Calthack, something like that. And this little calabash was rattling around in the bottom of an apothecary jar. You can see the big crack that's across it. It was once sealed with a leaf tied on with twine, but that's cracked and broken. So the contents have been accessed at some point in the past. So it's no longer sealed. It's a little bit in poor condition, and it was rattling around in the bottom of this jar. So one of the things that we wanted to do then was just to make this safer. So we've made it a nice little plastozote nest so that it can be more secure within its outer packaging. And then fixing down that lid better so that you're aware that you are looking to open it if you're trying to get in there. You have a purpose for doing that. And at the same time as looking at this kind of jar, we also had, we were lucky enough to have an intern, Gina Alnat, who'd been to one of the biocultural curating workshops at Kew and came back fired up with enthusiasm to look through our collections to see what there was in the way of potential hazards. So one of the main ways of mitigating the risk from these, of course, is for people to be aware that there might be a hazard within the boxes or the drawers that they are about to encounter. So she was looking at a kind of list of usual suspects of toxic plants, such as here we've got ordeal beans, Strychnus nux vomica, and the rosary pea, so the one that people occasionally poison themselves in making jewellery. And so she was going through the various jars and boxes, adding hazard signs, adding that to the records, and at the same time we wrote documentation. So we had standard operating procedures for in the event that anyone asked to access this material, or in the event that anyone asked to try and sample from this material, so that we had some paperwork in place for that kind of work. Not that it has happened in the intervening time, but it was, it was good to know that we had it there to rely on in the event that was going to happen. And so those of you who are on the ball will also notice that these there are old hazard symbols. So if you go to the HSC website these days, this is the hazard pictograms which are currently in use. So this is a piece of work that we'll have to undertake to go and update the labelling that's on these items to bring them in line with the current usage. But I mean, on the whole, I prefer that they have something than nothing. So this will be something that, now that the museum has reopened and we're thinking about having more people coming back in to use the collections again, this is something to start picking up on and updating all of this kind of risk management work. So what that will also give us, going back and looking again at the labelling on all of these, is it gives us the opportunity for some condition checking too, because obviously the level of risk that anyone is going to face will change depending on the sort of state that the material is in. So if you have a completely safe entire box full of entire ordeal beans, that's a kind of different scenario to if there's been a pest infestation, it's all been converted into dust, and the lid is leaking. That's suddenly a much more dangerous object than it might have been previously. So there's more ways of coming into contact with something that might have a residual poison within it. And so this has got me thinking recently as well about thinking about what we might need to say in terms of allergens that people could encounter within this space. So again, because the museum has been closed to visitors, and that includes within the collection spaces for some time, in that time we've had a specialist arts college move in, for instance, of which there are members of that college who we know have severe nut allergies, for instance. And so thinking about the information that I need to supply to our learning and engagement team and other groups within the museum, to make people aware of the potential hazards as we open up, if you're inviting other users in who aren't perhaps regular herbarium users, but are coming from a slightly different background and perhaps are not likely to be aware that we would contain material that might be individually dangerous to them. It isn't helped, of course, by the fact that everything is under its taxonomic systems, under its scientific name. So you're not, if you're not aware of what the name of a peanut is, you're not going to be able to not open that drawer either. So that brings then, for the last bit of my talk, onto more in line with everyone else's talk so far, and moving into the area of legislation and things which are expensive. So in terms of toxins and poisons that are still present within herbarium materials, obviously one of the things that we have to consider is the hallucinogens and psychoactive substances that are potentially still contained within drug plants in herbaria. So I'm going to give a bit of a run through the different kinds of legislation that touch on, that cover the things that could be within a botanical collection. And so the first and biggest bit of the legislation really is the Misuse of Drugs Act. So this is the one off which all the other subsequent legislation hangs. And this is what really criminalizes certain substances. So this act creates a list of controlled substances, those which are prohibited. It introduces the offences that sit alongside in terms of import, production, possession, and supply of those materials, and it lists the penalties that sit alongside those offences. Now, under this act, the controlled substances are classified broadly into three classifications, A, B, and C, with an extra one of as yet to be confirmed. So they've got a sort of temporary holding space for anything new that they want to bring in, but haven't yet decided where it should sit in terms of those classes. And these classes really relate to, I suppose, what's considered the severity of the crime and the kind of societal impact and harm that's caused by the misuse of these substances. So the Misuse of Drugs Act is, there's the link there, so I will also share all these links for everyone to have a look through and to digest the wonderful legalese if you feel that this is something that you're going to need to consider for any of your collections. So the second piece of legislation then, which is most relevant to botanical collections, is then the Misuse of Drugs Regulations 2001. So if the preceding act set aside what are the controlled substances and making them illegal and associating the various crimes in terms of having those substances, then these regulations are really setting out the mechanisms by which certain groups of people can legally use, dispense, or move those products. So this sets up the mechanisms for recognizing, people such as doctors and prescribing chemists, also, for instance, policemen in the chain of custody of something that's been seized. So it's acknowledging that there are legitimate reasons why you might be holding this material or coming into contact with it or having to give it to another person. And it's setting out the mechanisms by which those processes can happen and the licensing under which that is permitted to occur. So these regulations then, it takes the same list of scheduled substances, but this time they are split according to 5 different schedules, and these do not necessarily bear relationship to the 3 classes under which you might be charged with an offence. So this is talking more about the potential usefulness of the controlled substance. So it's looking really at their legitimate uses for medicine, whether these materials are ever prescribed. And so the schedules 1 and 2 at the top will have the highest level of control, and that decreases as you move through to schedule 5. So schedule 1 then will be those substances which are not considered to have any therapeutic benefit and are not prescribed. They are solely used in research situations. Whereas schedules 2 to 5 will contain medicines that are acknowledged to be useful and that people can still legally prescribe under certain conditions. Schedule 2 then will be those medicines which are prescribable but are still acknowledged that they can do significant harm, and this is particularly at the level of the individual or patient or the person who might misuse it. So for instance, schedule 2 will contain those drugs which are very addictive. So thinking about heroin, for instance, heroin would be a Class A drug under the 1971 Act, but it would be a Schedule 2 drug under the regulations of 2001, in comparison to raw opium, which would be a Class A drug. So it's the same offence to be illegally in possession of it or supplying it, but it is a Schedule 1 drug because there's no known current usage for it in medicine. It's solely for research purposes. So for us in herbaria then, the important list is that of the Schedule 1 substances. So this link here is through to the government website, which has the comprehensive list of all of those scheduled substances. It is on the basis of chemical name, so this makes it slightly difficult to interpret. You have to spend a lot of time reading through it and working out whether something does or does not relate to any kind of natural material that you might be holding. So for instance, you won't find heroin written on there because it will be called diacetyl morphine, something like that. That said, some of them are easier to go off and read from the list, such as cannabis and coca leaf. This is how they are described under the legislation. So I've gone through and I've pulled out 6 here that seem to be ones which you could feasibly encounter within a botanical collection. Cannabis is probably the most likely. Coca leaf can crop up, particularly if you have medicinal collections. There's any kind of fungus which contains psilocin, which is magic mushrooms, and any of the species that could be used for that. Cat was only added into the list of scheduled substances in 2014, so this was a relatively new one to be brought under the legislation. Prior to that, there was no control and there was no need to license or consider how to use it differently. Then we have alkaloids associated with LSD, or which might be used as precursors for the production of LSD, and these are principally within fungi such as ergot. So on the right here, we've got Claviceps herbaria with a picture from Europeana showing the fruiting bodies erupting out of an ear of rye. And this one's quite interesting because it may be within a herbarium as a specimen of the fungus, but it's also possible that it is just within a herbarium collection because it's naturally occurring on members of the Poaceae. So it might be there without anyone having truly acknowledged that it was there. And then, of course, raw opium. So the products of the opium poppy, but not the poppy straw itself, which is exempt under the legislation. So in the event that you find that you have any of this material, in order to be holding it or in possession of it, you have to apply for what is known as a domestic license to possess. And importantly, this just allows you to be exempt from the offence of possessing these Schedule 1 substances. That does not allow you to supply them. So in terms of usual museum business, that makes it very difficult to loan or to have someone come and destructively sample and take a specimen of it, because you would need an additional license for supplying the material, and then they would also need themselves another license to possess, because that license is site specific. It is only for your building, and it is based on the conditions that and the circumstances in which the material is being held. So even within the university, if there are licenses within different academic faculties, they are not transferable between themselves. You have to do the work within a single department. The licensing scheme is referred to as self-funding, which means that it has a fairly steep structure of fees, which has been mentioned previously. And in addition to that, there are various additional costs which you might, some of which you will, some of which you might have to take into consideration. So there has to be a DBS check for any individual who is named onto the application for a license. And by holding a license, you are stating that you are going to comply with the Misuse of Drugs Safe Custody regulations of 1973. And so this is a very specific set of rules which revolve around your record keeping practices in order to create auditable trails of who has had access, how much material you've had in weight terms, and whether that changes. You have to have very specific standard operating procedures with wording that is available on, I think, on this website here, as the bottom one will take you through to some of that. And also very specific storage conditions and different types of cabinets that are required for the safe storage of this material, well, the legal storage of this material. So to give you an idea of the kind of costs that would be associated with holding this material, then, if you are newly discovering that you have Schedule 1 material within the herbarium, the initial application fee for getting a license is £3,133. It lasts for a year. So every year you have to reapply for the license. And so a renewal cost is generally lower. So that will be £326. But on a sort of 3 to 4 year rotational basis, there will be a requirement for a compliance check. So this then will be a heftier fee to enable a visit to oversee your storage conditions, check over your paperwork, and to see how well you are complying with the safe custody regulations. And that then means that every 3 to 4 years you'll pay £1,371. So all told, it's quite an expensive business in perpetuity. So as I say, every person who's named on the license has to have had the enhanced DBS check, and that is through the preferred supplier of the Home Office. It can't be a pre-existing DBS check that your staff may have through any other work that has been ongoing. So that has to be through their particular company. And then, as I said, there's likely to be an additional cost in putting into place the various systems and the equipment that's needed to be in line with the legislation. So, for instance, thank you, Alan, for sending me this website, is a series of cabinets which have the right kind of lock and the right kind of compliance with the British standards for meeting the needs of the safe custody regulations. So these would have to be installed and your material would have to be contained within it. You would have to be having a paper trail of who goes in, who goes out, how much it weighs, what everything is, and what each of those specimens is. It is, however, if you've got one license, it covers all of the material. So if you think, oh well, I could get, I've found all these unfortunately scheduled material within the collection, it isn't good enough to just get rid of the higher risk material. So if you were to say, look to dispose of, say you've got a piece of opium somewhere, that wouldn't be enough if you also have a herbarium sheet with a magic mushroom on it and perhaps a piece of cannabis. You would have to get rid of all or none. And if you are looking to dispose of material, that's also quite challenging because there are systems and procedures that have to go through for that. And there are only certain individuals who are licensed to destroy or take away the material. Often that might be the police at your local police station who have the proper authority to do that, or within a larger organisation such as the University of Manchester, there's someone within our risk and compliance team who has that authorisation to destroy Schedule 1 material. So on that happy note, that brings me to the end really. And so I think the main thing I was thinking, having thought about the kind of things that we've been finding in our herbarium over the last couple of years, is that really it's much like any other kind of system of risk assessment, is that you can't just think about it and think, oh well, I've ticked that box. It's something which has to be a kind of ongoing process of re-evaluation. Some of that is as a result of external changes with the rules and regulations, but then some of that will be the consequences of changing internal practices, changes to the physical building structure or your storage conditions, and also things like, for me, I think I need to start considering the different users and potentially different staff members with different, less specialist knowledge of how herbaria work, for instance, to be able to put in place a kind of risk management for any hazards that they might encounter within our space. So as I said at the beginning, this is really me thinking about the things that I'm very familiar with in Manchester, but obviously collectively, as all the people who manage herbaria, we all have encountered the various quirks of our collections, and so there is an absolute wealth of information out there. If you're having any kind of challenges or you've come across something that you're not certain about, then do reach out. We are more than happy to help answer some of those thornier problems. So thank you very much for inviting me today, and thank you all for listening.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Rachel, and definitely food or not food for thought, because I have a weird little memory that I may have come across an ergot specimen, and I'm just thinking, oh God, I'm gonna have to do a thing. So in the comments we've got Donnie Nicholson said in terms there are dangerous goods trainers he's put a link to that in the collections, although that may be I don't know, is that applying for the previous talk, maybe, perhaps, sorry.
Yeah, so I think that's one.
Yeah,
I'm going to worry about my toxic dusts in packages now after that talk as well.
I know, right? Yvette is saying, if a herbarium happened upon a dodgy specimen, perhaps a sheet of cannabis, is it possible to send it on a long-term loan to a registered institution to avoid the expense of your own institution? And thank you so much, Rachel. Really thought-provoking, worrying, great to know.
Yeah, so legally, Tivi? No. So if you are transferring material to another institution, then it's largely requires someone who is permitted to move that material to be the one who moves that material. And so that's where it gets interesting, because you have to find someone who has a license to supply controlled substances, which would largely be the police or various others. Jack's got his hand up, so if he wants to say what he's saying while I read the comment from Lindsay.
Yeah, mine's a question for you, Rachel, rather than a response to that question.
Oh, is it? Okay. Go ahead.
So Jack, go ahead. What was your question to Rachel?
It's going back at least 10 years, but we had a NatSCA training, or perhaps it was when we were talking to the relevant authorities about drug licensing. But the question came up of, has anyone in the licensing process ever proved that herbarium specimens contain any of the active substances that they're actually worried about? The answer at the time was no.
No.
And I wonder if that's got any further since in the 10 or 15 years.
Not wildly further. So there are some. I have done some extensive searching in the past. That was probably not quite the 10-year mark, but might be coming up on it. And there were some papers, but they were really contradictory. Some yes, some no. I mean, it was no one size fits all in particular across different, especially across the different kinds of controlled substances. There's also the situation of what kind of pre-treatment things have had, or what they might have consequences of it getting other kind of pest management treatments in there. So I think it's possibly a bit of a, yeah, you can imagine you might get some kind of nice decay of a particular substance in your experimental conditions, but in real life, what that looks like from herbaria to herbaria, between collector and collector, I think there's always going to be some level of difference. And it hampers us really with this whole question of supply, because if you're a museum who holds a license, you probably don't have the equipment by which you could test these things. Someone else has the equipment and might have the interest, but you can't give them the material. So there's a sort of awkward situation there. I know Leeds, Claire had been doing some work looking at other potentially allied plants and chemicals such as hops, to see whether they could look at a kind of decay process in something that didn't have all the kind of legal problems around it. But yeah, there hasn't been really a significant amount of work in it. And I think part of the problem is we're just such an off-target problem for the Home Office. You know, we're really not a high-risk kind of business in this terms, that there's no real incentive against all the other challenges that have to be done around changes to legislation for Brexit, for instance, to think about this, because we were having some promising conversations with the Home Office, again, that might be getting on for 10 years ago now, around changing the licensing. So there's no way of making cannabis not illegal, but you might be able to change, say, something that's in a historic collection, a material that is recognizably quite old, probably you're more likely to give yourself mercury poisoning than you are to get high, that maybe there's a different licensing scheme that could be brought in. So it was all looking quite promising for a while, but yes, sadly, life got in the way, and that kind of dropped off the radar from the policy folks. So I've read through Lindsay's comment of a geological example of taking in a bequest and having had the family pack it into bags and brought them in, and finding that as a kind of mixed jumble of poisonous and radioactive samples all together, of which the donor wasn't aware of the risks that they posed, and so no one knew. And certainly I think that is the way that we approach our herbarium. We know that there is some that is poisonous, the majority of it probably isn't, but to treat all of it with caution as if it is. And certainly when it comes to unlabeled clear fluids or white powders, yes, assume the worst before you start dusting it with enthusiasm, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I know that in a place that I worked at before, we had a very small amount of material. So I think we had like 2 old cannabis plants on sheets, and we had maybe 3 packets of psilocybin containing mushrooms in the fungi collection, and we did not have a lot of money. We had like 0 expenses for anything like that. You know, and we're half the time juggling, you know, redundancy worries and things like that. So there was literally 0 funds. But you know, it sort of stuck in my craw, the kind of like, so we're going to have to destroy our collections. Is that what you're saying? So I just kind of thought, well, I'm just going to go to the horse's mouth. So I rang up the local police and I said, you know, could you come and have a look at our stuff? And am I going to get taken away?
Sort
Sort of thing. Yeah. So the policeman came around. He had a look. We had a cup of tea. Very important to include a cup of tea and a biscuit. Bribery always works. You know, and he said he very much enjoyed his visit. He's found it really interesting, and he said, when, you know, from a police point of view, it is this is of no interest to the police, and we would not be pursuing it further. And I just kind of left it at that, and that was really, I mean, great, but a weird no man's land, because, you know, if you're working for a local government or, you know, a university, you know, we're all institutions here which have to answer, you know, to public inquiries and Freedom of Information Acts and things like that. You know, you have to always show your labeling and your information is always kind of really all the T's are, you know, crossed and the I's are dotted. And so I was like, well, I'm just gonna leave it, just walk away slowly and close the cupboard. But that's not a great.
It's a really uncomfortable position to be in, because I mean, as organisations, beyond the sort of legal requirement, we do like to see ourselves as being, you know, ethically upstanding, don't we? To leave yourself in a position of knowing there's this enormous and frankly terrifying raft of legislation out there, and you've got this thing in the cupboard which, you know, realistically is got no street value, but is actually covered by it, is a very uncomfortable position to find yourself in. It's also in terms of arguing that your collection is valueless by saying that there are no active compounds in this, that there is nothing that anyone could ever use for science. That's an equally uncomfortable position to be trying to say that you're devaluing your specimens in that way. And then if you are looking to dispose, because it's not just the amount of money, it's the idea of the amount of money forever, is that really you're saying that I can't afford to look after this material, and so it is a sort of disposal for financial reasons in that sense. And so none of the options feel good, really, as to what you might be able to do with it.
Saying as well that, you know, even disposal perhaps with its own issues in terms of like doing it lawfully and through the right channels, and, you know, perhaps handing it over to the police, that kind of thing. Amy,
Amy had her hand up.
Yeah, but it was kind of going up and down, so I don't know if we may have answered it.
Sorry, that's my internet connection. I'm putting it into the chat. I can never resist mentioning, just on the topic of the hazards of chemical disposal, Buin solution. It has picric acid in it. It can explode. The nature of waste storage usually means there's oxidizing agents next to explosive agents, so fuel for fire. And this didn't happen in the National Museum of Ireland, but I was having a great cup of tea and chat with the chemical waste disposal unit that we had contracted in. And a lot of secondary schools had teachers who retired chemistry teachers. This fixative had dehydrated on the press. The bomb squad had to be called in, and the school had a great day where they blew it up on the football pitches next to the school. So it's worth bearing in mind and keeping on top of your waste, or at least being aware of some of the hazards, because I enjoy that story, and it does tend to stick with people, that if it dehydrates, that's the issue.
The only story I have like that, Amy, was once upon a time when I was a placement student and someone was doing a DNA extraction from avocado and managed to make something resembling TNT, which blew out the front of a fume cupboard.
Oh my gosh.
Didn't know that was possible.
Dangerous avocados.
But yes, I mean, we're quite lucky in the herbarium in a sense, because we've had that much building work. I'm fairly confident we've got no nasties left in cupboards that shouldn't be there beyond the actual specimens themselves. But that has been some work that my colleagues have been doing recently, going through our other natural history stores and finding those bottles which may or may not still have a label on them, and trying to look for suitable routes of disposal. So, you know, that kind of information is really helpful. Thank you.
Well, that's given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much, Rachel. We really appreciate it.